The Echo of Shadows. Chapter 1. The first time Lucia heard the whisper was 3 days after moving into the house. A barely audible voice, like the rustling of the wind against dry leaves, that seemed to call her name from somewhere in the basement. She dismissed it as a figment of her imagination, a natural consequence of the accumulated tiredness after weeks of boxes, paperwork, and hasty decisions. The house itself was an extraordinary find, a late 19th century construction on the outskirts of a small coastal town, with sea views and a ridiculously low price. Structural problems, the real estate agent had explained with a tight smile, nothing a good builder can't fix. Lucia, recently divorced and desperate to get away from the city, hadn't paid much attention to the cracks in the walls or the damp stains on the ceiling. Nor to the history of the place, which the agent had mentioned briefly, something about an eccentric and lonely former owner. By the 5th day the whispers had become more frequent. They were no longer just coming from the basement. She could also hear them behind the walls of the master bedroom, in the hallway leading to the bathroom, even in the kitchen as she made her morning coffee. And it wasn't just her name anymore. They were now broken phrases, single words she couldn't quite make out. "You should check the insulation," Elena, her only friend in the village, suggested when Lucia told her about the strange noises during her visit. "These old houses are like resonance chambers for the wind and the pipes." That night after Elena left, Lucia woke up with a start at 3:27 a.m. It hadn't been a noise that had interrupted her sleep, but a sensation, the absolute certainty that she wasn't alone in the room. She lay motionless under the sheets, eyes open in the darkness, listening to her own labored breathing. And then she heard it clearly. "Lucia, I found them." Chapter 2. The next morning, with dark circles framing her eyes, Lucia wandered through the municipal library looking for information about the house. The manager, an elderly woman with wire-framed glasses, watched her curiously as she searched through the local archives. "The house on the cliff? Not many people ask about it," she said in a tone that tried to sound casual. "It's been empty most of the time since the incident." "What incident?" Lucia asked, feeling a chill run down her spine. The librarian hesitated a moment before answering. "Dr. Vidal and his family. Unfortunate business. They moved there in 1978. He was a researcher, I seem to recall. His wife and 2 young children disappeared one stormy night. Their bodies were never found. He claimed they were still in the house, that he could hear them through the walls. He was admitted to a mental institution after he tried to knock down the walls with an axe." Lucia returned home with a folder full of yellowing newspaper clippings. She spent the afternoon reading about Eduardo Vidal, a respected neurologist whose obsession with altered states of consciousness had ruined his academic career. The articles described how, after his family disappeared, the doctor had developed a theory about interdimensional passages in the structure of the house. "The walls are not solid," he said in an interview before his admission. "There are spaces between realities where they are trapped." That night, Lucia decided to do what any rational person would do: pack her bags and leave at dawn. As she packed her clothes into a suitcase, she found a small black notebook she didn't remember ever seeing before. Opening it, she discovered pages and pages of tight, nervous handwriting she recognized from the articles. Dr. Vidal's notes. "The children say there are doors in the shadows. Maria heard them first. Now she's on the other side too. I can hear them calling me, but I can't find my way to them. The equations must be incomplete." The rest of the notebook was filled with incomprehensible mathematical formulas and diagrams of the house with marks in specific places: behind the fireplace, on the north wall of the basement, under the stairs in the attic. Lucia closed the notebook with shaking hands when she heard childish laughter coming from the hallway. Chapter 3. "There's no one living in that house with you, Lucia," Elena assured her the next day as they shared coffee in the kitchen. "I promise. You just need to rest." But Lucia wasn't so sure anymore. The night before, after finding the notebook, the sounds had intensified. They were no longer just whispers. She could now hear entire conversations, footsteps running down the halls, laughter and cries that seemed to come from empty rooms. Most disturbingly, following Dr. Vidal's diagrams, she had found markings in the house that matched his notes exactly. Tiny symbols carved into the wood, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. "Maybe you should stay at my house tonight," Elena suggested, looking worriedly at her friend's haggard face. Lucia nodded, grateful. As she packed a small bag with the essentials for the night away, Vidal's notebook fell open on the table as if pushed by a draft. Elena took it, curious. "Where did you get this?" she asked, frowning as she turned the pages. "I found it among my things," Lucia replied. "I think it belonged to the previous owner." Elena stopped on a page and visibly paled. Lucia? This is impossible. What's going on? This photograph, it's me. Lucia moved closer to look. Sure enough, stuck between the pages of the notebook was a black and white photograph of someone identical to Elena, but dressed in 1970s clothing, standing in front of the house. On the back of the image was an inscription, Maria and Elena, summer of '77. She was my great-aunt, Elena murmured in a trembling voice. She disappeared before I was born. My mother named me after her in memory of her. They both looked at each other in silence, processing the implication. The Maria in Vidal's journal was Elena's great-aunt. What if everything the doctor had written was true? Chapter 4. That night at Elena's house, Lucia couldn't sleep. The words from Vidal's journal echoed in her mind, doors only open when they recognize someone linked to them. The connection between Elena and Maria was that bond. It was no coincidence that Lucia had met Elena, nor that the house had crossed her path. At 3:27 in the morning, Lucia sat up in bed in the guest room when she heard a familiar whisper. Lucia, come with me. I need to show you something. The voice was Elena's, but when Lucia turned on the lamp, she discovered that she was alone in the room. A chill ran down her spine as she noticed something beneath the door, a blue, pulsating light that shouldn't be there. As she opened the door, the hallway of Elena's house was no longer there. Instead, she saw the hallway of her own house, but distorted as if seen through wavy glass. The walls seemed to breathe, subtly expanding and contracting. And at the end of the hallway, a figure she recognized as Elena was beckoning her to follow. Elena? Lucia called, hesitating in the doorway. The figure smiled in a way that didn't seem quite right. Not exactly. But you can call me that if it's easier for you. Chapter 5. When Lucia woke up, she was back at home in her own bed. The light of dawn filtered through the curtains, and for a moment she thought it had all been a dream. Then she noticed the mud stains on her bare feet and Vidal's notebook open on her lap, with a new inscription in a handwriting she didn't recognize. You're part of this now. You can't leave now. The doorbell startled her. When she opened it, she found a pale, distraught Elena. You left my house last night, she said without preamble. I saw you get up and walk to the door as if you were in a trance. I called you but you didn't answer. Then the door closed on its own and I couldn't open it until dawn. Lucia tried to explain what she remembered. The distorted hallway, the figure that looked like Elena, the feeling of walking between overlapping dimensions. As she spoke, she noticed her friend staring at something behind her with a horrified expression. Turning around, Lucia saw what had caused that reaction. All the walls of the living room were now covered in symbols identical to those in Vidal's notebook, drawn with what looked like damp earth. She didn't remember having made them. We have to get out of here, Elena insisted, tugging at her arm. Right now. But as they tried to cross the threshold of the front door, they both stopped short. Where the front garden and the street beyond should have been, there was only a dense gray fog that seemed to stretch on infinitely. We can't get out, Lucia murmured, finally understanding. We're already on the other side. Chapter 6. The next few days passed in a kind of lucid nightmare. The house no longer pretended to be normal. Spaces were constantly distorted. Hallways that stretched into infinity, rooms that appeared where they hadn't existed before, doors that led to different versions of the same rooms. Elena and Lucia stayed together, trying to find a way out, following Dr. Vidal's notes as their only guide. In their most lucid moments, they theorized about what was happening. It's not that the house is haunted, Lucia explained as they examined the symbols on the walls. It's that it exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Vidal discovered this and somehow altered the balance, creating passages between realities. And his family? Elena asked. I think they did the same thing we did. They crossed over without knowing they couldn't come back. Sometimes they heard voices, children's laughter, fragments of conversations that seemed to come from another time. Occasionally they glimpsed figures in the periphery of their vision. A child running down a hallway, disappearing around a corner, a woman watching them from a mirror's reflection, only to vanish when they tried to speak to her. And always, a constant, was the feeling that someone, or something, was guiding them toward a specific purpose. On the seventh night, they both woke simultaneously at 3:27 a.m. A luminous symbol they hadn't seen before had appeared on the wall opposite their beds. A complex network of lines that seemed to vibrate with a life of its own. It's a key, Elena murmured, and they both knew instinctively that she was right. When they touched the symbol at the same time, the wall dissolved like smoke, revealing a descending staircase that corresponded to no known part of the house. Chapter 7. The stairs seemed to have no end, spiraling downward into ever denser darkness. The air grew colder as they descended, and a strange humming sound like that of an electric current gradually increased in intensity. "Who do you think is behind all this?" Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum. "I don't think it's a who," Lucia replied. Vidal's journal mentioned something about a house consciousness, as if the place itself were a thinking entity. Finally, the stairs ended in a wide, circular chamber whose walls were completely covered in the same symbols they had found throughout the house. In the center of the room was a stone table on which rested a small metallic device that pulsed with the same blue light Lucia had seen the night it all began. And beside the device, sitting as if he had been patiently waiting for them, was a gaunt-looking man with a scraggly white beard. "I was waiting for you," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I'm Eduardo Vidal." Chapter 8. Dr. Vidal was not crazy as the newspapers had suggested, but he was not entirely sane either. 40 years trapped in the in-betweens of reality had altered his perception of the world in ways that were evident in his wild eyes and the jerky way he moved, as if parts of him existed at different moments in time. "The house wasn't always like this," he explained to them, examining the device with shaking hands. "I changed it. I was researching the nature of consciousness, the possibility of parallel existences. I built this," he pointed at the device, "to amplify brain waves, to create a kind of bridge between mental states. But it worked too well." According to Vidal, the device had altered not only her perception, but the very fabric of reality around the house, creating a convergence point where multiple dimensions overlapped. Her family had not disappeared, it had been fragmented across these dimensions. "They are here in a sense," the doctor continued. "But they are also in other places, other times. Sometimes I can see them, sometimes I can hear them. I can never reach them." "Why have you brought us here?" Lucia asked, although she already suspected the answer. Vidal pointed at Elena. "She has the blood link to Maria. And you, Lucia, have a receptive mind, sensitive to frequencies that most cannot perceive. Together, you can do what I could not do alone. Stabilize the device so that I can shut it down properly. And if we don't want to help you?" Elena challenged. Vidal's smile was that of a man who had long since lost the ability to understand normal human emotions. "It's not like you have a choice. The house has chosen you. Either you help me close the doors, or you'll end up like my family, fragmented for all eternity." Chapter 9. The ritual, for there was no other word to describe it, required absolute precision. Following Vidal's instructions, Lucia and Elena stood on opposite sides of the stone table as the doctor recited complex mathematical equations that sounded like arcane incantations. The device began to pulse more rapidly, and the blue light intensified until it was almost blinding. The walls of the chamber seemed to dissolve, revealing glimpses of other places, other times. The house as it was in 1978, the municipal library, the storm-lashed cliff, unfamiliar scenes from places that might not even have existed in their dimension. And between these fleeting visions, faces. A small child with frightened eyes. A woman who looked remarkably like Elena. People caught between realities, watching them with hope and despair. "Focus," Vidal ordered, placing both women's hands on the device. "Visualize the doors closing, the dimensions separating cleanly." Lucia closed her eyes and tried to do as she was told, but a childish voice whispered in her ear. "Don't help him. He'll trap us forever." Opening her eyes, she saw a boy of about 6 standing over her, perfectly solid and real, staring at her intently. "He doesn't want to close it," the boy continued. "He wants to control it. If he succeeds, he will have power over all realities." Lucia looked at Vidal, who was still reciting equations with increasing fervor, and then at Elena, who seemed to be in a trance, her glassy eyes fixed on the void. She made an instant decision. Instead of visualizing doors closing, Lucia imagined the device disintegrating, the connections breaking irrevocably. She channeled all her will into that one mental image. Vidal's scream of rage confirmed that it was working. Chapter 10. The collapse was as violent as it was sudden. The device exploded in a flash of blue light that enveloped the entire chamber. Lucia felt as if her body was breaking apart into microscopic particles and then recomposing incorrectly. There was pain, confusion, and then silence. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on the floor of her living room. The normal house with the moving boxes still unpacked. Elena was beside her, slowly awakening. "What happened?" her friend murmured, sitting up with difficulty. Lucia wasn't sure. The memories seemed blurry, like a dream that fades upon awakening. Had they destroyed the device? Had they returned to their reality? Or were they in yet another version of the house, another fold of the dimensional fabric that Vidal had altered? There was no sign of the doctor or the black notebook. The walls were clean without symbols or marks. Everything seemed normal. Except for one detail. In the hall mirror, for a fleeting moment, Lucia thought she saw the reflection of a small child smiling at her before disappearing. And when she looked at the clock, it read exactly 3:27. Epilogue. 6 months later, Lucia and Elena had managed to resume a semblance of normality in their lives. Lucia continued to live in the house, which had shown no further signs of dimensional anomalies. Sometimes, when the wind blew a certain way, she thought she heard whispers behind the walls, but she had convinced herself that it was just her imagination. Elena had researched the history of her great-aunt Maria and had discovered documents that suggested that she had indeed known Dr. Vidal before her disappearance. One afternoon, while Lucia was tidying up the basement, she found a small metal box hidden behind a loose panel. Inside was a photograph of the entire Vidal family, the doctor, his wife and 2 small children, smiling in front of the house. And next to the photograph, a note written in the same handwriting as the black notebook. Doors never close completely. They just need the right key to open again. Thank you for setting us free. Someday perhaps we will meet again. Lucia put the note and the photograph in her pocket and climbed the basement stairs, determined never to go down again. As she closed the door, she thought she heard a child's laughter in the distance. But this time she chose not to listen.